Hi, my name is Joe Scorcio. I'm an American of Italian descent. Um, as I think most Americans can honestly say, we are all immigrants at some time in our past. Some are way back. Mine's a little more current. My grandparents, all four of them, immigrated from southern Italy, from a small town in southern Italy at the same time in the early 1900s. And my parents were born here in the United States. And there's an interesting story that affected my life the whole way through that I'm happy to share in Italian Heritage Month. And one of them was both of my grandfathers came over when they were younger than teenagers. One was 11, the other was 10, traveling separately. My paternal grandfather traveled alone. He was met by uh, a host family here in the United States. He was 10 years old. My other grandfather on my mother's side, he was 11, and I believe he traveled over with an uncle who guided him through. But these were kids, and they embarked on separately at different times, not knowing each other. They both ended up working for the Great Northern Railroad and went from the East Coast across through to Spokane for one destination and Portland, Oregon for the other. And eventually they had their own experiences where they went back to Italy and they shared some of those with me. They got their wives, my grandmothers came back over and set up a life in these two cities. And eventually, years later at a wedding, because of a wedding, my mother and father met. That's a story in and of itself. But the immigrant experience for me has always been one of tracing their journey. I went back to that town that we were from, and we were talking about a town of 1,000 people, two families out of that 1,000, unrelated, um, met by circumstance here in the United States, and my parents were married, and as a result of that, my brother and sister and I were born. But my grandparents experienced immigration quite differently. They didn't talk about it much, but what they did told volumes about it. One of them was, as an example, my maternal grandmother never learned to speak English. She lived in this country for more than 50 years and only learned enough English to eventually pass her citizenship test when she was in her near 60s, nearly 60, because there was a threat of deportation. I don't know how real the threat was, but in her mind, that was something she did share with me. My two grandfathers were both hardworking men and a lifetime in the railroad work. Uh, they were amazing individuals, and the stories that they had to tell about hard work and what it did were quite amazing. My parents, however, were raised by these very, very traditional people, and that I found interesting. My mother could have been born in Italy and would have fit right in. My father was much more Americanized by that time. And they settled down, and after this unusual meeting and got married and decided to settle in Spokane where we were raised. But my mother, as traditional as she was, refused to let us learn to speak Italian, even though that was the language of our grandparents. And it made communication with our grandparents difficult, but I never really understood the reasons. I did ask her about it many times over the years. And her biggest reason was she didn't want to stand out. She didn't want us to look like or act like immigrants. Even though my mother had no accent, my father had no accent, and they both spoke Italian and English fluently, they didn't want their kids to be stigmatized in any fashion. Okay, that's what happened. We never understood it, and the three of us, my brother and sister and I, all questioned that. But years later, I think I understood. And the more I've worked with immigrant communities and with people who are new to the United States, that challenge of getting past the bilingual nature of their families is an amazing challenge. That first generation never gets rid of the accent. The second generation gets rid of most of it. The third generation, it's gone completely. Learning that taught me a lot about how I think to interact with people who are having their own immigrant story. Theirs may be sooner or later than mine in the history, but as I said, 100 years is nothing. I celebrated on the days that my grandfathers arrived at their 100th year. I had a celebration to honor each of them for making a journey that I don't believe I could have ever made, but they did, and they built something tremendous from that. I'm the youngest of my generation of the kids and the cousins, but I was the first to graduate from college. And the rest many of them went to college, but never graduated. I did, went to advanced degrees and had a professional career. And I believe that my grandparents would have been amazed by that. They would have been pleased. Certainly, my grandfathers would have expected it, and they would have expected nothing less. So I feel like I honor them every day by remembering what they went through to get here. And that's my Italian heritage story.